Kazuo Shinohara was a hugely influential figure in post-war Japanese architecture, and he was best known for his individual houses. 12 years younger than Kenzo Tange, he nonetheless exhibits points of contact with Tange's very different view of Japanese and world architectural history, as well as the latter's interest in nascent cybernetics. From the 1950s, mid-1950s, at our Tokyo Institute of Technology, Shinohara combined a re-examination of traditional forms with an investigation of modernist tenets, later to prove significant in the light of the high-tech and information technology yet to come in the final quarter of the century. This image is actually a slide that was made by him, and it was used as the theme for the topic of his studio at Yale University when Shinohara was the first visiting Eero Saarinen professor at Yale. And at that time, this particular feeling for Tokyo had not become as popular as it was later to become in Europe and elsewhere, and as well known as Shibuya. This is actually an area, it's one of the sub-centers of Tokyo with a major railway station, but the station was only built in 1911, at which time this was an area of open fields. So things change quite rapidly. Here's the main Okayama campus flagship building of our university, Tokyo Tech, designed in the mid-1980s by Professor Shinohara. It was opened in 1987 as an alumni hall commemorating the 100th anniversary of the university's founding. That was just 30 years ago. The statement here, tradition may be a point of departure for creation, but never a way back, was one of Professor Shinohara's aphorisms, and tends in a general way to answer the question raised by the title of the present exhibition here at CCA, Besides History, whose title I think works a little better in French than it does in English. The glass-fronted book and video rental shop pictured here may even in subtle ways have been influenced by the aesthetic propounded by Shinohara toward the end of his career, despite the relative banality of this actual building, which of course is not his. Through a series of 4 self-designated styles, Shinohara's career evolved from a very early attempt to secure and neutralize Japanese vernacular tradition. By the 1960s, he had emerged as a fierce anti-metabolist. The metabolist movement, of course, began in 1960 under Tange's influence and in connection with the World Design Conference that was held in Tokyo in that year. The later stage of Shinohara's career was broadly open to technological innovation and to a domestication of Japan's urban chaos, if you can say so. Shinohara had begun with an abstraction of emotive qualities that he often confusingly refers to as symbolism. In the third style, which I want to examine later in the talk, and here in the subsequent 4th style, Shinohara's method attained a somewhat distanced agnosticism toward history. I feel that theme is also one of the foremost topics of the present show. It's significant, for instance, that Go Hasegawa in the present show is a student of Shinohara's twice removed within the genealogy of our school via the architects Sakamoto and Tsukamoto, who are both familiar to this institution. Speaking of the supersonic twin-engine, two-seater, variable sweep-wing fighter aircraft developed by Grumman and first deployed in 1974, with which he was deeply impressed, Shinohara noted how the plane lacks the smooth and streamlined form one generally associates with aircraft. He continued, the square jet intakes, the adjustable wings, and the fuselage seem to have been clumsily joined together so that each could perform its function with maximum efficiency. Shinohara wrote in 1988, a shining metallic cylindrical surface, which you see here, floating above the grove of academe, dominated that is his preliminary image of the building. He continued, I extracted the concept of zero-degree machine from the discovery of a binding relationship between seemingly indifferent components and the whole. In products of super technology, for example, new fighter planes and lunar modules, there was beginning to occur, he says, an untoward level of interaction between form and function. I focused upon activities of light and dry spaces amidst the extreme chaos of Tokyo's urban status quo, and from there derived the concept of progressive anarchy. This is an approximate east-west section showing the original basement location of the University Museum down below, and the four supervening levels culminating in the portion of the half-cylinder that is bent out of line. 30 years ago, this decision on Shinohara's part to deviate from a linear form occasioned untold difficulty in the calculation of the structure, which was eventually undertaken in-house by us at Tokyo Tech. The linear portion of the half-cylinder is aligned with Mount Fuji, with the eventual bar in the foreground, overlooking the school's principal railway station, at that time still a wooden structure at grade level. The walls are covered in a sort of silvered Hessian cloth. A few years ago, Kersten Gers decided to hold the final jury for his studio at Tokyo Tech in this space, which is temporarily disused, but the walls proved unsuitable for student pin-ups, as you can imagine. Here is the planar configuration of that same fourth level with effectively inverted thermal windows. I don't mean the kind that you have in Canada. I mean Roman thermal windows, inverted at either end. Kitchens were never a strong point of the zero-degree machine, and this one had to be remodeled by Yoshi Tsukamoto. Here it is, this triangular space at the bottom. But there was only so much that Yoshi could do, given its shape and access. A notable feature is the dumbwaiter, bottom center, expressed on the exterior in its own stand-apart vertical cylinder. Shinohara again wrote, another example of this same kind of clumsiness of design is the spacecraft that first carried man to the moon. The aluminum-covered plastic shield of the craft, not shown here, used to protect it during its passage through outer space, free from air resistance, struck me as being even more roughly assembled than the form of the Tomcat fighter that you just saw. One of Shinohara's first non-residential buildings, or public buildings, the Centennial Hall, stands near the beginning of his self-designated fourth style. It's a multi-purpose alumni hall, now largely devoted to an expanded university museum, originally confined to the below-ground level. Characteristically, the Centennial Hall reflects a controlled version of Tokyo's urban chaos, the so-named progressive anarchy. Emphasis is upon vertical development of a trapezoidal floor plan bounded by a greater and a smaller rectangle. Not space, but rather structure and shape, with a distinctively oblique angled fourth level, originally conceived of as literally as a cylindrical volume floating above trees. From this brief introduction, let's return to each of the four styles individually, beginning here with the first. This is the Umbrella House, 1961, a key early work whose site occupied considerably less space than the F-14 Tomcat fighter a decade later. The total area of the Umbrella House is only 55 square meters. The plan, as you can see, is subdivided into roughly equal living and sleeping areas, sleeping on the top here. The step-up elevation of the sleeping areas and its square-based tatami-matted floor recalls the division between the packed earth floored kitchen area of a Japanese farmhouse and its other rooms. The important step-up entry of the vernacular townhouse is only schematically indicated in this scheme. There is as yet no actual earthen floor, which will become one of the themes, one of the distinctive features of many of the first style houses. The roof and the apparent ceiling of this house do not present a characteristic of Japanese residential architecture of any period. Instead, this is a metaphor for an oiled paper Japanese umbrella, a form and material that has today been relatively abandoned. Here is the wooden-floored living area, screened by normally outdoor sudare blinds, and with a ladder here to the left, giving access to storage above the tatami floored portion, which is behind the sliding doors, and comprise the bedroom. Apart from the non-residential metaphor of the umbrella, the clue to the first style essence of this small house is the engineered timber span of the broad eaved roof in what is a totally non-traditional dimension and structure, despite initial appearances. The following slides depict a pair of matching houses for two brothers in a hilly suburb of Kobe in West Japan. Once again, the elements of plan and design may look somehow traditional, just as they would do to our Japanese students today, but they are not. Here is a conscious and purposeful violation of prototype and genre, whereas much Japanese design of the late 20th century and the 21st century said to be inspired by tradition, a little bit like inspired by Starbucks. I don't know if you have those here, in addition to the original Starbucks, is instead reduced to a loss of the concept of genre. Not in this work, but in so much other work today. In Shinohara's first style, intentional references to tradition are inevitably exotic, and aberrations, when they occur, are also intentional. A calculated attempt to isolate and secure traditional design aims, whilst often excising the actual forms. The plans are severely compact and functional, although the square shape that is so often a feature in Shinohara's work is non-traditional, not to mention the massively reentrant corner, which addresses the neighboring fraternal residence, but not in a sense that is easy to define. According to Shinohara, spaces in Japanese buildings pertain to a gridded volume and were divisional, not additive. This changes to some extent by the mid-17th century in Japanese architectural history, but by that time, additive spaces are usually contained in separate pavilions, clearly not the case here or anywhere else in Shinohara's oeuvre. Similarly, these cutaways are visible in their violation of roof pitch and tiling, duly resonate with the topography of Hanayama, or Flower Mountain, which is the name of this suburb, an area today much more densely occupied. The use of shoji-screened windows and the semi-exposure of diagonal roof struts are both characteristic of Shinohara's long and arduous questing in this first style. Think here, then, of Le Corbusier's self-designated patient research, a term so often employed by the Franco-Swiss architect with reference to the path of his own creativity. This is an interior view of one of the houses with these non-traditional shoji and a structure which, again, may look traditional but is not really. Also here, more or less similarly. Here, once more, is the violence done to symmetry in all its frank exposure. Note also the use of, at foundation level, of masonry technique drawn from the ramparts of Japanese fortification architecture in what here is partly a retaining wall structure and unusual in its integration with the actual fabric of a residence, although not perhaps unknown in vernacular practice, for which Shinohara at this time had a very keen eye. The elongated corridor from the entrance into, finally, the living room is a feature of vernacular residences, especially in the old capital city of Kyoto, with its long, narrow building lots as those were laid out in the pre-modern period. The photos of this period, photos of the houses, were made by photographers employed by monthly architectural journals or by a handful of professionals whose activities were devoted to architectural work. The shots are carefully staged, often with imported furniture. Here above is that kind of oiled paper umbrella to which the umbrella house you saw previously refers. Another view, again, with the exposed structure and the long corridor. Now, although not the last, House in White is the culmination of Shinohara's first style. The plan is severely subdivided into a full-height living room, living dining area, and a two-story sleeping and study space. There is a complete absence of any traditional entry. Footgear removal, because of course you take off your shoes when you go into a Japanese house, is relegated to the outside space beneath the broad overhang of the roof eaves. This partie is best illustrated in section, and the house is one of the most famous of the second half of the 20th century in its unique transition from tradition and the evolution of a Western-style main space. At the left, you see an example of Shinohara's sorry, at the right, you see an example of Shinohara's famous exploded details as they occur in his working drawings. The shoji screens are employed entirely out of any traditional carpentry context, given the abnormally high and unsubdivided portion of blind wall above. The carefully selected Kitayama cedar pillar here from Kyoto is central to the layout and to the structure of the house, but asymmetrically placed within the space of this main reception room. To the architect's own surprise, House in White had achieved a non-Japanese verticality that heralds his first change in style, that from the first to the second. The notion of frontality that adheres to Japanese tradition is largely retained here. The idea that architecture is viewed always from face on, not from an angle, or not from a perspective. Adheres to Japanese tradition is largely retained here, yet undermined by the eccentric placement of the cedar pillar, allowing the space to revolve to a certain extent. This is a known feature of Le Corbusier's late style, whether at La Tourette or in his Tokyo Museum of Western Art of 1959, 7 years before this house, and that was Le Corbusier's only work set in Asia east of Chandigarh. I referred a couple of times to Le Corbusier, but actually, it's interesting. Shinohara had never seen the buildings of Mies, but he was deeply interested in Mies, I think probably more than Le Corbusier. Shinohara, also I hadn't mentioned yet, was originally trained as a mathematician, took a degree in math and taught math for a couple of years before he came to Tokyo Tech and was retrained as an architect. That is unusual. It's unusual anywhere, but it's almost unheard of in Japan to do that. The exterior of House in White shows that the configuration is actually borrowed from a small temple in Hyogo Prefecture, where it's one of the few religious works in the 12th century, so-called Big Buddha or Great Buddha style, that originated in the rebuilding of the Great Buddha Hall of Todaiji at Nara by a known monastic master builder of the 12th century called Chogen. Actually, that episode in Japanese architectural history is well illustrated by Isozaki in the book that I edited of his for MIT, which is called Japanness in Architecture. You may have seen that. And the chapter on Chogen in the middle of the book is actually the best place to begin the book, I think. The style and its structure, that is the Big Buddha style, which is left fully apparent inside the smaller Jodoji temple at Ono, is utterly unrelated to any tradition of residential planning. Kenzo Tange also made use of this same style, which he took from the Great South Gate at Nara in his Kagawa prefectural government office, which predates House in White by 7 years. So both of these architects were interested in this particular unusual and very special style. It's unusual and special in the way that style itself is articulated, and it's also extremely unusual in the 12th century that we know who actually designed a building. That would be true of almost any country, I think. Now, I'll show only two works from the second style that evolved from that verticality that had emerged nearly unconsciously for Shinohara in the reception room of House in White, which we've been looking at. First, the uncompleted house of 4 years later, and then the aptly named Cubic Forest, completed in the following year, 1971. The second style comprised just 10 houses, which date from the 1970 uncompleted house, which you'll see in a moment, to the tiny Prism House of 1974, which is actually Shinohara's smallest work. In this second style, Shinohara's self-declared research aims relate to his investigation of high European modernism, which is to say the simplified geometrical forms of the international style of 1920s and 30s. Examples of high modernism were designed and built in Japan at that time, but Shinohara, trained mathematician that he was, felt his own need to reanalyze such forms. First made public at New Year's 1971, the New Year's edition of Japanese architectural magazines are always the most important. The uncompleted house was published at least once, showing only the isometric view of its atrium and dual approaches, and I'll show that slide in a moment. The name of the house derives, in this case, from the fact that the facade was deemed by Shinohara as incomplete, partly in connection with a proposed addition which was never built. So the atrium has no designated function. I've eaten dinner there, but it's not a dining room. It's just a space that is key to the design, but has no specified function. This is the second level of the same house, of course. The many staircases that you see in works of the second style result in a somewhat M.C. Escher-like effect, and it's more or less from this period or phase that Shinohara's interest in topology, for which he, unlike most other architects, had sufficient mathematical background to articulate, comes into play. The famous Dutch graphic artist Escher died in the year following the publication of the uncompleted house. I have no idea if there's actual influence there or not, but the feeling is somehow very similar. This is the slide that I told you about a few moments ago. Shinohara regarded this tall space with its skylight and two large fixed windows as an abstract composition deeply interconnected with human emotion. Those are his descriptive words. Yet of this space, which in some respects he felt to have been purged of emotional content, Shinohara also wrote, "I continue to mull over the potential of deriving from such an approach clues with regard to a new functional space." This is the view of the atrium from the ground floor entry of the house. Those things in the middle are ventilation devices that were used quite a lot at this period in Japan. You can see them in some of Isozaki's works as well. And a view of the atrium with that circular skylight. Here, spaces that Shinohara refers to as two main rooms are connected by a so-called fissure space. The first main room and second, and the fissure space obviously in the middle, which is scarcely a component of high modern spatial articulation. This is his own device, but it was for Shinohara a main component of the second style investigations. These four elevations of cubic forest are recognizably, I think, modernist, even retardataire. However, the Western style window had always been regarded as a special challenge by Japanese architects right up to Shinohara's generation, for the reason that traditional Japanese buildings, for the most part, do not include fixed dimension apertures. Shinohara perceived the work as a house made of cubes. This is the plan, and you can see the two main rooms on the fissure space. The house, whose client was a well-known Japanese painter, is visitable today. This is one of the rare houses by Shinohara that anybody can see. He pursued, I was explaining to Lev, he pursued a policy in his life, during his lifetime, of never disturbing the client after a house had been handed over. And at Tokyo Tech, we have to follow that policy as well, which is sometimes a source of great disappointment. The Swiss, it turns out, are very good at knocking on doors, but we can't condone that. It's understandable. However, on the website of this museum, it's a museum of the artist's own work, it's noted that architects are unwelcome as the building has been besieged by design professionals who pay almost no attention to the works of art by the owner's late father that are displayed on the walls. That's really true, actually. This is an original photo, an original publication photo of main room 2. Finally, this is a shot from a different second-style house, giving a sense of Shinohara's emotional fissure space of the early 70s. The third style, once again, consists of 10 houses, but spread over a period of 8 years, thus double that of the second style. These date from 1974, the year I arrived in Japan, until 1982. It turned out to be a style based very largely on site or constructional constraints, or both. In that sense, it's somewhat more comprehensible than earlier styles without any external knowledge of the architect's own preoccupations and investigations. Nonetheless, such data still make for an increased clarity of interpretation when viewing the third style works. The client of the Tanikawa house, 1974, is a well-known Japanese avant-garde poet. He's also the translator of Charles M. Schulz's Peanuts cartoon storybooks. It's a summer house located in a deeply wooded compound in central Japan, which is cool in summer with very heavy winter snowfall. As you can see here, the Tanigawa house is a relatively uncomplicated timber structure, almost barn-like, you could say. The slope covers 9 meters in the course of a 1.2 meter ascent. Shinohara wrote, "I made up my mind not to assign any meaning to the naked ground of the slope other than the numerical values of its gradient." The client asked Shinohara to provide a summer or meditation space, whilst the living quarters to the rear of this section occupy only 1/4 of the volume of the construction and are spread over 2 levels, just as in the house in white that we saw. As seen here, the summer space is a full-height area with an unobstructed view of the lower surface of the roof of the house. It occupies 3/4 of the entire floor plan. Shinohara wrote, "Its walls exist solely in their function as walls, and the columns express only their function as columns." You may not actually be able to see it, but what's unusual here more than the division of the plan is the fact that the natural earth of the slope over which the Tanigawa house is disposed was left completely unfloored. This is not the vernacular packed earth mixed with lime that occurs in pre-modern Japanese houses. It's simply a barren slope, and actually in the summertime you get a few little weeds and things growing. The ladder behind is a piece of sculpture, although it can be climbed. Shinohara wrote that in this summer space you feel, and I quote, "you feel a certain anxiety, and you begin to walk around in an attempt to alleviate this by discovering its source. There are numerous ways to cross through or traverse the space, and together these generate an assemblage of meanings." Here's the disposition of the plan, summer space and the winter space, to the so-called winter space to the left. As can be seen, the summer space contains 2 pillars of square section this time, each supporting a pair of roof struts. The house would be unused in winter except for accessing nearby skiing or the seclusion of the poet for a bout of writing. This, 2 years later, in the southern island of Kyushu, another summer house was created for a well-known Japanese abstractionist painter with a 2-story concrete living wing at top here, and a double-height north-lit studio at the bottom. From the curving access road, a double carport is reached with a truss bridge formed of stainless steel elements extending toward the sea below in the direction of the studio on the right and the living quarters on the left. The site is large, but it slopes steeply and is therefore mostly unusable. Shinohara noted that the site is parabolic in shape and the bridge is placed along the main axis of the parabola. Again, the mathematician showing through. Here is the favored view of a house in Itoshima, which looks in the direction of the Korean Strait, and it enframes a small mountain island by means of a fixed plate glass window that, seen in color, reminds me at least of a Magritte painting. This element is nearly 3 meters square, the fixed window, and is seen here from the carport. Twin entries are set to either side of it, left and right. Meanwhile, the landscape surroundings are thus transformed into an architectural space. That's one of the things, for example, that you see in the exhibition with Go Hasegawa's House in the Forest. I think that sort of happens. Here is the barefaced concrete of the artist's studio with its circular top light. However, both the bridge and the outdoor atrium are paved in white marble by contrast. This artist's paintings are very large, and his studio is a space for action painting. If you look at the 2G special issue on Shinohara of, 4 or 5 years ago, you can see recent photographs in color of the artist actually at work, which may be more interesting. Space for action painting, which Shinohara noted as being endowed, like the living quarters opposite, with some of my most serious attention to issues of everyday life. This is house in Hanayama, number 4, also at Kobe, same suburb, another brother. The 35-degree slope falls a total of 9.5 meters beneath the large reinforced concrete residence, lightened by an independent steel frame that constitutes the topmost level. The house is for yet another brother and is connected to the older south house in Hanayama of 12 years earlier. That's the one with the huge re-entrance section in the square plan. The roof terrace from which a view of Kobe Harbor in its entirety is to be had, and also the ribbon windows that characterize the facade were regarded by Shinohara as referring to the international style that I mentioned earlier in connection with his second style, thus derived, as he wrote, from the infancy of modern architecture. While the north and south houses at Hanayama concentrated on the configuration of interior space, the theme of house number 4 was said to be Sachlichkeit, or objectivity, that in the sense of the term used by German architects, cameramen, product designers, and even writers in the 1930s. Here is the relationship between this house at bottom and the 2 earlier family dwellings at Hanayama near Kobe. This is a view of one lateral facade. You can see the strip windows, ribbon windows, showing the columnar supports and the parapet surrounding the large terrace near the top of the house. This is a night view of the parlor, little parlor that overlooks the roof terrace, and its interior with a hard sofa and large circular table designed by Shinohara for the acoustical plywood paneled space. 1 year later, a house was designed in Tokyo, actually near our university, for a family with the perhaps dubious distinction of living under the passage of high voltage electrical lines. As can be seen in this schematic, the shape of the house and its roof is exactly derived from the precise specifications of the power easement, the architect having eschewed their common tangent as compromising the space of the upper story. So he used each easement separately in the design of the roof. This view shows how the house and the HV lines look in reality from one side. Both the principal facades, in other words, the two narrow facades, are formed of glass blocks, another reference to 1920s, 1930s modernism. Beneath the continuous concrete strip vaulting, which you can see here, designed to eliminate heavy individual horizontal beams, of which only 2 instances placed in traverse are supported by a pair of very thick round section pillars. Pillars and beams, but not the vaulting itself, are painted in strong colors that vary from level to level of the house. This is not in color, but you can see one of those pillars here and the way the vaulting is designed. This is a night view of the house from its rear garden with a slatted wooden deck that recalls the traditional engawa, common to both houses, and some Japanese religious architecture. In other words, this sort of porch-like platform that reaches toward or into the garden. Here is a particularly Zachish view of the stair, which is actually has bright red metallic handrailings. I'll finish with the fourth and the final style of Kazuo Shinohara, to which the Centennial Hall at Tokyo Tech, 1987, you saw at the beginning, also belongs. Although the fourth style includes 3 additional public buildings and 3 houses, this evening I will show only house in Yokohama of 1985, for which Shinohara was his own client. The small house of only 72 square meters includes a main living floor above of some 40 square meters and a lower level sleeping area comprising nearly 32 square meters. The foreground area of the 540 square meter site is unbuildable, but there's an older timber frame structure dwelling behind and connected with the new structure which served Shinohara as an office or an atelier. The land was leasehold, and when it was sold, house in Yokohama was destroyed. It was hardly lived in, but was instead designed largely as a showpiece and was never published as being the architect's own residence. So this is actually the upper level plan. The upper level was a single unitary space for living and dining with a convenience kitchen, by far the most common type of post-war plan for houses and apartments all over Japan. Window apertures are arranged to catch a particular view, as with the lone pine tree bottom left, framed by a tall, narrow opening. The porch is a surreal feature that goes nowhere in particular, as you can see here. Entry to the site is to the far right, beyond the edge of this view of the east facade of the house. The slide shows the junction with a pre-existing dwelling, and the quarter cylindrical profile of the house was designed so as not to deprive the older building of sunlight. The frequent and intended misalignments, this is Shinohara's word, of the third style segued into what he called the disjunction of the fourth style. For example, the Centennial Hall. And these, again, are terms employed by the architect himself: misalignment, disjunction. Space remains relatively unimportant, as would be the case in Japan's urban environment. Japanese are famous for not being good at public squares or circuses or whatever. In the traditional town or traditional city, there were very few such places. preeminence is accorded here to shape instead. This section is taken through the mid-space of the lower level, showing the large moon window of the tea room, small tea room in the lower level, and the semicircular door to the storage area at the western end of the upper level living room. Actually, this was also the first time that he had ever used computer graphics. It was an old-fashioned, sort of clunky computer that was operated by one of the students, but it's the only example that we have of CGs actually in his work. This is the lower level plan with a very small bedroom and then a tea room that is only 2 mats underneath that porch that we saw. Up above is the footprint of the older pre-existing house that was used as his studio after he retired. A section taken through the kitchen area of the upper level above, depicting the outer western wall of the tea room. This is a sheet from the album of working drawings for the house, showing a characteristic exploded constructional detail at lower left here. Another elevation. This is that porch. I have no idea if it was ever intended for actual use, despite the provision of a glazed rain-protecting overhang. The 2-mat tea room can be glimpsed through the large circular window, and a few older post-war dwellings may be seen across the street. My final 2 slides are details of Shinohara's storage unit, used for wine, among other things. The hinged door is semicircular and the overall geometry insistent. This is more or less the same view that you have in the exhibition in the photograph by Richard Pear, without showing the interior of the storage, but from his study desk toward this semicircular door. Lastly, this is the east or rear door of that storage space, facing the upward continuation of the sloped lot. The end gable of Shinohara Atelier, the older house, is visible at left in what 50 years earlier would have been a completely rural city of 1 million inhabitants, 50 years before that. Par ailleurs, aujourd'hui, la ville de Yokohama possède 4 millions d'habitants et la maison de Yokohama n'existe plus. Thanks for your attention and for listening.